In an arid stretch of the American Southwest, a man rejects a multi-million-dollar offer for a dry piece of land inherited from his grandfather, leaving everyone perplexed. While businessmen and family pressured him, he held a sacred promise in his heart. From the cracked soil sprouted not just water, but hope for an entire community. This is a story of faith, resilience, and love for the land that will move you deeply. Prepare yourself to discover the true treasure hidden in that patch of ground. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The sun beat down mercilessly on that expanse of cracked earth, where not even the hardiest lizards dared linger for long. It was there, in that desolate landscape, that Ethan Miller stood, sweat dripping from his brow, a crumpled letter in his right hand. The offer was as clear as the water that was missing from the soil. $5 million for a piece of land that, in the eyes of any sensible person, wasn't worth a tenth of that. And yet, he had just torn the paper into small pieces, letting the dry southwestern wind carry them away like sterile seeds that would never sprout. "Have you lost your mind, son?" His mother Carol's voice echoed in his memory from the previous week, when he had announced his decision to the family gathered for Sunday dinner. "Your grandfather left you this piece of nothing out of sheer stubbornness. He was always a dreamer, with no grasp of reality. But Ethan knew something no one else saw. Or perhaps it was just faith, the same faith that sustained the old women who, with rosaries in their calloused hands, prayed for rain during novenas at the main church. Faith. What a strange word for an engineer who had graduated with honors from the flagship state university, accustomed to precise calculations and meticulously planned projects. He took 3 steps forward and crouched down, scooping a handful of that dry earth between his fingers. He felt its texture, its temperature, its weight. How much is the memory of a hug worth? What is the cost of a promise made into the tear-filled eyes of a dying old man? There wasn't a spreadsheet in the world capable of calculating that. The shadow cast by his body on the ground began to lengthen, heralding the late afternoon. On the horizon, the sun descended majestically, painting the sky with orange hues that seemed to set the sparse clouds ablaze. It was the magical hour his grandfather called God's sigh, that brief moment when nature seemed to pause and contemplate its own beauty before surrendering to the night. "Money runs out, grandson. But the land remains." The words of old Jedediah returned like a mantra, whispered by the same breeze that now caressed his face. "This land is thirsty, but it has a soul. And one day, you'll understand what it hides." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the dry air fill his lungs. He needed to head home, where Megan was probably waiting with a worried expression and renewed arguments about how selling the land would solve all the family's financial problems. How could he explain to her that some decisions don't fit the logic of numbers? How could he make her understand that sometimes you have to listen to what your soul cries out, even when reason advises otherwise? He got into the old pickup truck he had inherited along with the land, another treasure his grandfather had insisted on keeping, despite constant mechanical problems. He turned the key and the engine coughed 3 times before finally responding. He started the drive back to town. As he passed the entrance to the property, he looked one last time at that seemingly useless vastness. "I'll keep my promise. Grandpa," he murmured to himself, "even if everyone calls me crazy." The news that Ethan Miller had turned down millions for a worthless piece of dry land spread through the small town of Harmony Creek like wildfire. In less than 2 days, there wasn't a local bar counter, hair salon, or circle of porch chairs where the subject wasn't being discussed, analyzed, and judged. "Old man Jeremiah's grandson has finally lost it," said the owner of the general store while weighing a pound of beans for a customer. "I always thought those studies at the university would end up messing with the boy's head. They say it's his wife who's desperate," commented the hairdresser while applying dye to Mrs. Davis's white hair. "Poor thing. Gave up a good job in the city to follow her husband in this crazy idea of moving back here. And now this." And so, while the town buzzed with speculation, Ethan began to implement the plan he had been quietly developing since his grandfather's passing 6 months earlier. In the small office set up in one of his house's bedrooms, He spread out maps, geological reports, and books on farming techniques for arid regions. Sleepless nights followed one after another as he searched for answers to questions he wasn't even sure how to properly formulate. On one of those nights when the clock hands had already passed 3 in the morning, Megan appeared at the office doorway, her eyes red with exhaustion and worry. "Ethan, please, come to bed." He looked up from the papers in front of him, as if waking from a trance. He noticed his wife's deep dark circles, the way she leaned against the doorframe. "Just a little longer, Meg. I'm almost onto something important." "You say that every night," she replied, with a sigh that carried more resignation than reproach. "The kids asked today if you're sick because they hardly ever see you anymore." Those words hit Ethan like a slap. He thought of Leo and Sophie, his 8- and 6-year-old children, waiting for the father who spent more time with maps and plans than with them. "I'm sorry. It's just that." I know, Megan interrupted, approaching and placing a hand on his shoulder. "You feel you owe this to your grandfather, but your grandfather wouldn't want you to sacrifice your family for a piece of land." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Ethan, that offer is still on the table. $5 million. We could give the kids a better life without worries. You could open your own engineering office right here if you still wanted to stay." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The offer was tempting, especially when he saw the sacrifice his family was making. He had left a promising position at a multinational corporation to return to his roots, driven by the promise made to his dying grandfather and the inexplicable certainty that this arid land held a precious secret. "Just give me a few more weeks, Meg. If I can't prove it's worth it by then, I'll reconsider the offer." She looked at him with those green eyes that had captured his heart back in college, eyes that now revealed a mixture of love and disbelief. 3 weeks, Ethan. After that, we need to think with our heads, not our hearts." The next morning, Ethan drove back to the property, this time with a more defined purpose. He brought some basic tools, wooden stakes and rolls of twine. He would begin marking the areas according to the rudimentary plan he had sketched out during his sleepless nights. The sun hadn't yet reached its peak when he was surprised by the approach of a much newer and more powerful pickup truck than his own. The vehicle stopped in a cloud of dust, and out stepped Arthur Mitchell, the businessman who had been trying to buy the land for months. "Good morning, engineer," he exclaimed with fake cheerfulness, adjusting his expensive sunglasses on his nose. "I see you're determined to start your project." The way he pronounced the last word made it clear what he thought of the venture's chances of success. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Ethan replied curtly, continuing his work of driving a stake into the parched ground. "You know, I've been thinking," the businessman continued, walking towards him. "Maybe our offer wasn't attractive enough. How about we keep the $5 million and add a house on the beach? I have a place in the Florida Keys that your wife and kids would certainly enjoy." Ethan stopped what he was doing and faced the man before him. Tall, well-dressed, with that air of someone used to getting everything he wants. He represented everything Ethan could have been if he had stayed in the city, pursuing the promising career he had abandoned. "What do you really want with this land, Mitchell? Because I'm not fooled into thinking it's about its current real estate value." An enigmatic smile appeared on the businessman's lips. "Let's just say I have a vision for the future, my friend. This country is changing, and places like this," he made a broad gesture encompassing the entire property, "are going to become much more valuable very soon. I'm just getting ahead of the curve. Or maybe you already know something I'm supposed to figure out," Ethan countered, closely watching the other man's reaction. For an almost imperceptible instant, Mitchell's mask of confidence wavered, but he quickly regained his composure and let out a forced laugh. "You were always smart, Miller. Top of the class in college, everyone said so. That's why I can't understand this obsession of yours with a piece of land you couldn't even raise goats on." He took a few steps towards his truck, then stopped and turned back. "The offer stands for another 15 days. After that, I can't guarantee we'll still be interested. Think about your family." And with those words, he drove off, leaving behind a cloud of dust that made Ethan cough and shield his eyes. When he could finally see clearly again, he noticed he was no longer alone. A few yards away, leaning against a dry tree, stood an elderly man he recognized as Old Man Hemlock, an old friend of his grandfather's. "Big money makes noise, but the truth comes in silence," the old man said, approaching with slow steps aided by a rustic wooden cane. "Your grandpa knew that. Do you know why my grandfather valued this land so much?" Ethan asked, feeling a sudden surge of hope. The old man smiled, revealing several missing teeth. "Jeremiah was a man of few words and many secrets, but he told me once that the wealth of this land wasn't above or below it, but in it." Ethan frowned, trying to decipher the riddle. "What does that mean, Mr.
Hemlock?"
"It means you're looking in the right place, but maybe with the wrong eyes," the old man replied, patting his shoulder friendly. "The land speaks, son, but only those with patience can hear it." In the days that followed, Ethan dedicated himself entirely to working the land. With scarce resources and relying far more on willpower than proper equipment, he managed to mark out the areas that, according to his studies, had the greatest potential for starting experimental cultivation. He hired a tractor driver to plow a small portion of the land and began implementing a rudimentary rainwater harvesting system. The family's savings, however, were dwindling rapidly. One afternoon, returning home, he found Megan sitting at the kitchen table with several bills spread out before her, her eyes glistening with tears. "We can't make the kids' school payment this month," she said, without looking up as she sensed him enter. "And the bank called about the payment on the loan we took out for the irrigation pipes." Ethan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He sat down heavily in a chair, unable to find words to respond. "I sold my jewelry yesterday," Megan continued, now looking directly at him. "The pieces my grandmother gave me. It covered a few bills, but it won't last long." "Meg, No, Ethan, I don't want to hear any more promises or theories. The kids need stability, they need a future. I supported you when you wanted to come back here. I understood your need to honor your grandfather, but this has gone too far." Takim. That moment, Leo and Sophie ran into the kitchen, interrupting the conversation. They were excited, coming from the neighbor's house where they watched cartoons on TV, a luxury their own home could no longer afford after they had to sell the television to pay debts. Dad, guess what we saw at Mrs. Carmichael's house?" exclaimed Sophie, her eyes shining with excitement. "There was a man on TV making a garden in a place just like your land. It was all dry and then it turned green and pretty." Ethan smiled, despite his exhaustion and worries. He crouched down to his daughter's level and ran a hand through her curly hair. "Is that right, Princess? And how did he do it?" "He put in plants that don't need much water," explained Leo, adopting a professorial tone befitting his curious nature. "And he made special holes that save the water when it rains." "Cistern," corrected Sophie, proud to remember the difficult word. "It's called a cistern." Something clicked in Ethan's mind. Cisterns. Of course, how had he not thought of that before? The simple technology of cisterns had been transforming the lives of thousands of families in arid regions. It was a straightforward, inexpensive, and efficient solution for capturing and storing rainwater. That same night, after the children were asleep, Ethan presented Megan with a new plan, more modest and realistic than the previous ones. He talked about cisterns, drought-adapted crops, ancestral techniques that could be combined with modern knowledge. "I need 1 more month, Meg. Just 1 month. If we don't get any concrete results by then, I'll call Mitchell myself and accept the offer." Megan sighed deeply, as if gathering her last reserves of patience. 1 month, Ethan, not a day more. And so, with a tight deadline and scarce resources, Ethan intensified his work on the land. During his research, he discovered there was a government program offering technical assistance for building cisterns on rural properties. He applied, but the bureaucracy suggested that help, if it came, would take much longer than the 1-month deadline he had. It was then, one Sunday after church service, that Father Jim announced to the small congregation, "My friends, we all know the hard times our community is facing. The drought punishes our lands and our hopes. But today, I want to propose something different. Our own Ethan Miller is trying to implement a project that could benefit many families in the future. How about we gather for a community work bee next Sunday to help him?" Like in the old days, when our parents and grandparents joined forces to build ponds and houses. Ethan, sitting in the back pew, felt his face flush as several faces turned in his direction. Some expressed curiosity, others skepticism, and a few showed that characteristic glimmer of renewed hope. The following Sunday morning, to his surprise, more than 20 people showed up at the property. Men, women, elderly folks, and even some children, all bringing what they could offer: tools, food for a potluck lunch, or simply the strength of their arms. Among the volunteers stood out Miss Josephine, a woman nearly 80 years old, whose dark, lively eyes contrasted with skin wrinkled by sun and time. While the men dug according to Ethan's instructions to create the cistern's base, she watched intently and occasionally made comments that were surprisingly wise. "Don't dig there, son. The land is saying it's not a good spot," she said at one point, pointing to one of the men. "See how the ants make a path detouring around that spot? They know what they're doing." Initially, some chuckled at the old woman's comment, but Ethan, intrigued, asked them to check the soil in that location. To everyone's amazement, they found a large rock that would have made excavation impossible, or worse, could have compromised the entire structure if construction had started there. "How did you know?" Ethan asked, genuinely impressed. "My people were on this land long before any settlers arrived, son," she replied with an enigmatic smile. "We learned to listen to what it has to say." Throughout that day, Miss Josephine shared precious knowledge about drought-resistant plants, about nature's signs foretelling rain or prolonged drought, about how certain herbs everyone considered useless could actually enrich the soil. "That pungent weed growing over there," she pointed to a plant with jagged leaves and a strong smell, "not only serves as medicine, but also attracts insects that help other plants grow strong." As the day progressed and the work advanced, Ethan felt something growing inside him that he hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine hope. He saw in the sweaty faces of the volunteers not just fatigue, but also a sense of shared purpose, as if the project was no longer just his, but belonged to the entire community. When the sun began to set and people returned to their homes, the cistern's base was ready, and a small area had been prepared for experimental planting. It was little compared to what needed to be done, but it represented significant progress. In the following weeks, other work bees were organized. Every Sunday after service, a group, always varying, but never fewer than 15 people, headed to the land to contribute a few hours of labor. Little by little, the cistern took shape, and the first seedlings of adapted plants, suggested by Miss Josephine, were placed in the earth. Ethan divided his time between working the land and taking small engineering jobs he could find in town to supplement the family income. Nights continued to be dedicated to study and research, but now he had Megan's help. Touched by the community's involvement, she had begun to take an interest in the project. It was she who, one day, brought home an old book about irrigation, techniques used by indigenous peoples of the arid lands. "I found this at the public library," she explained, placing the worn volume on the table. "I thought it might be useful." Flipping through the yellowed pages, Ethan discovered detailed descriptions of ancestral methods for preserving soil moisture, harnessing morning dew, and identifying locations with a higher probability of groundwater. "Meg, this is incredible. Some of these techniques are so simple we could implement them immediately, at no extra cost." Ethan's enthusiasm was contagious. For the first time in many months, Megan saw in him the man she had fallen in love with. Brilliant, determined, driven by a purpose larger than himself. The 1-month deadline she had set passed without the topic of selling the land coming up again. Not because the financial problems had been solved, far from it, but because something deeper was now at stake. It wasn't just about honoring his grandfather's memory, or about stubbornness. It was about collective hope, about showing that, yes, it was possible to transform that seemingly useless land into something productive. Arthur Mitchell, however, hadn't given up. One afternoon when Ethan was working alone on the property, he showed up again, this time accompanied by 2 intimidating-looking men. "I see your community project is moving along," he commented with poorly disguised irony. Very nice. Very communal. Ethan continued reinforcing the structure of the nearly finished cistern without dignifying him with a response. "You know, Miller, you're starting to annoy me," Mitchell continued, dropping the falsely cordial tone. "My initial offer is off the table. Now it's $3 million, take it or leave it. And I suggest you take it quickly, because bad things can happen to projects like this. An accidental fire, for example, or vandals destroying all this nice work you've done." The veiled threat was clear. Ethan finally stopped what he was doing and faced the businessman. "Why is this land so important to you, Mitchell? What do you know that I haven't figured out yet?" A malicious smile crept onto the man's lips. "Let's just say I have inside information about certain changes that are about to happen in this region. Changes that will make the value of this land multiply by 10, 20 times. What kind of changes? That's none of your business. $3 million. Take it or leave it." Ethan felt his blood boil. This man represented everything he despised: greed, dishonesty, contempt for the less fortunate. "You can keep your offer, Mitchell. This land isn't for sale." The businessman gestured to the two men with him, who took a few steps forward in a clear display of intimidation. "Are you sure about that, engineer? It would be a shame if something happened to you. Your wife would be a widow, your children fatherless. And for what? For a piece of land that will never yield anything but hard work and losses." At that moment, the sound of approaching vehicles was heard. It was 3 cars carrying community members who, as had become customary, were coming to help with the late afternoon work after finishing their jobs in town. Seeing himself outnumbered, Mitchell backed down. "This isn't over, Miller," he threatened, before leaving with his thugs. The incident left Ethan deeply disturbed. It was clear the businessman knew something significant about the land, something that justified his persistence and even resorting to threats. But what? The answer came unexpectedly 3 days later when the small town was filled with unusual activity. Trucks with state government logos drove through the streets, and men in suits, clearly outsiders, chatted animatedly in local restaurants. "They're going to build a dam 10 miles from here," the barber told Ethan while trimming his beard. "They say it's going to irrigate this whole region. Land values are going to skyrocket." Now it all made sense. Mitchell had inside information about the dam project and wanted to acquire as much land as possible before the news became public and prices soared. But something still remained unexplained. Why did his grandfather value that specific piece of land so much, even before any rumors of the dam? And why was Mitchell willing to pay millions for it when he could have bought other properties in the area for much less? The answer emerged in the most unexpected way. During another community work bee, while deepening the excavation for a second cistern, one of the workers shouted, drawing everyone's attention. "Water! We hit water!" It was unbelievable. Less than 10 feet deep, they had reached the water table, an extremely rare occurrence in this drought-stricken region. Ethan fell to his knees at the discovery, tears streaming down his face. His grandfather knew. All this time, old Jedediah knew there was water beneath that seemingly useless land. That explained his insistence on keeping it, his final request. The wealth of this land wasn't above or below it, but in it, he repeated Old Man Hemlock's enigmatic words, finally understanding their meaning. The discovery of the water table completely transformed the project's prospects. With available water, even if not in large quantities, the possibilities for cultivation expanded significantly. More importantly, that water could be shared with neighboring families whose properties constantly suffered from scarcity. In the following months, the project expanded beyond initial expectations. With Ethan's technical guidance, Miss Josephine's ancestral wisdom, and the dedicated work of the community, small vegetable gardens began to flourish, producing organic produce that soon gained renown in the region. Megan, meanwhile, revealed a surprising talent for business. She organized the marketing of the produce, creating a brand that told the inspiring story behind it. "We don't just sell food," she explained to customers at her small stall at the farmer's market. "We sell hope cultivated in resilient land." News of the project's unlikely success reached a regional TV station, which sent a crew to do a report. the story of the engineer who refused millions for a patch of dry land, which ended up revealing a hidden treasure and transforming the lives of an entire community, touched viewers across the state. With media exposure came new support. A state university proposed a partnership to use the land as an experimental site for sustainable farming techniques in arid regions. An international NGO offered funding to expand the water catchment system. Young agronomy students regularly visited the site to learn and contribute. 1 year after the project began, what was once just a seemingly irrational dream had become a tangible reality. The land many considered worthless now housed a community learning center, focused on sustainable living in arid lands, directly benefiting over 50 families in the region. On a golden autumn afternoon, Ethan sat under the shade of a young pecan tree, one of the first fruit trees planted on the site. He watched. From a distance, Leo and Sophie playing with other community children among the green garden beds. Megan was coordinating a group of women learning food preservation techniques, using the surplus produce from the community garden. That's when he noticed Arthur Mitchell approaching. The businessman came alone, hands in his pockets, a different expression on his face. No longer the usual arrogance, but something close to respect. "Congratulations, Miller," he said, stopping a few steps away. "You proved me wrong." Ethan didn't respond immediately, surprised by the unexpected visit. "I came to make one last offer," Mitchell continued. $10 million. That's more than double my initial offer." A calm smile touched Ethan's lips. He looked around, at the now fertile land, at the people working together, at his children growing up in a community united by a greater purpose. "You know, Mitchell, my grandfather used to say there are things money can't buy." I never fully understood what he meant until now. He stood up and extended his hand to the businessman. "This land isn't for sale, it never will be, but you're welcome to learn with us if you want." Mitchell hesitated, then shook the offered hand. For a moment it seemed he might say something more, but he just nodded and walked away, leaving Ethan alone again with his thoughts. The gentle wind rustled the leaves of the pecan tree, creating a whisper that, to Ethan, sounded like his grandfather's voice. "The land remains," he had said. And now, finally, Ethan understood the depth of those words. It wasn't just about a piece of ground, but about roots. Roots connecting people to the place they came from. Roots sustaining communities. Roots intertwining to form a network of mutual support. Roots digging deep in search of hidden water amidst life's aridity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with those same colors his grandfather had so admired, Ethan felt a profound peace. He had rejected millions, yes, but he had gained something far more valuable. The certainty that sometimes the value of things isn't in what they can give us immediately, but in the potential for transformation they carry. And you, listening to this story now, might ask yourself, what would I have done in Ethan's place? Would I have taken the millions or bet on a seemingly impossible dream? The answer, like so many things in life, isn't simple or singular. It depends on what you value, what you consider success, what you understand as true wealth. Because, in E.T., the end, we all have our dry patches, those dreams, projects, or relationships that seem worthless in the eyes of others, but which, for us, hold a hidden potential that only the heart can see. And perhaps true wisdom lies precisely in this, in recognizing that some of the greatest transformations begin with a simple act of faith amidst the dryness, with the courage to say no to immediate security to pursue a vision few understand, but which may one day blossom again and nourish not just you, but everyone around you.